Today, we are going to make some grass. No, I'm not in Colorado, so it's not going to be that kind of grass. It's our techniques that are so simple and sensible, your mowers have practically built themselves.
Hello folks, it's Mad Dog Merv. Welcome to today's show. Today we are going to have one of my Pearl Harbor specials. We're going to be talking about the torpedo attack on Pearl Harbor. This will have excerpts taken from, what's his name, Hirata Matsumura. And this has to do with the Hiryu's attack unit. Specifically, in this group, you have the group that hit the USS Utah. So we'll be kind of going over his story of what he says about the attack, and hopefully you guys will learn something and enjoy this. So stay tuned.
So what we're going to start out with today is the writings of Hirata Matsumura, and he was the torpedo squadron commander for the Hiryu. His account given, well, at least parts of his account given of the torpedo attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, he led two groups. We'll talk about that in a moment. His group from the Hiryu and also the group from the Soryu, which is the one we're more interested in and I'd like to focus a little bit more on today. Here is a model of the Hiryu and what it looked like, and moreover Matsumura's plane, his tail number, and more of what it more than likely looked like. So we'll go ahead and get started with this, and hopefully you can follow along okay. Commander Murata was in command of the torpedo attack force, the entire torpedo attack force, which was comprised of 40 aircraft, 12 planes each from the Kaga and the Akagi, and 8 planes each from the Hiryu and the Soryu. As the senior lieutenant at the time, Matsumura from the Hiryu, was the sub-commander to Lieutenant Murata. His responsibilities were to lead the Hiryu and Soryu attack groups in an attack on the American aircraft carriers moored on the western side of Pearl Harbor. Murata was to strike American capital ships moored on the eastern side of Pearl Harbor. The primary targets were the American aircraft carriers and battleships, and the original plan was to fly directly towards Pearl Harbor from the north. And upon reaching the northern outskirts of Pearl Harbor, the attack force was to break into 2 groups, each group containing 2 carrier squadrons. Lieutenant Commander Murata's force was comprised of the 24 torpedo planes from the Akagi and Kaga. At 7:40 a.m. and within sight of the island of Oahu's north shore, Commander Mitsu Fushida, the overall airstrike leader, ordered us to get into our attack formations. Now, this is what Matsumura had said. He said that he fired, Fushida signaled by firing 1 flare, which meant a surprise achieved. However, after a short pause, Fushida, unsure if all of the groups in the or all of the air groups had seen the first signal, fired a second flare. The dive bomber attack leader, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, misinterpreted the delayed second flare as a forced attack signal and not a surprise attack. So Takahashi dashed ahead with his dive bombers to attack the airfields. This mix-up negatively influenced the torpedo attack on Pearl Harbor. The dive bombers became the first bombers to attack, thus the early attack alerted the American gunners before the slower, more target-prone torpedo planes could position themselves for an optimal run. The clouds over the Koliolu Mountains north of Pearl Harbor caused concern for the needed visibility required to execute the original torpedo attack plan. There was a decision made to make a last-minute change and delay the torpedo attack until the cloud cover dissipated, so they continued to fly a little bit further towards the southeast. And you can see in these last two pictures here, very similar conditions taken on a very similar day with the very similar lighting and the high cloud cover that did cause some real problems with the view of the harbor at the time. At 7:47 a.m., Murata waggled his wings to signal Matsumura to take the Hiryu and Soryu groups to commence their attack. Matsumura banked hard to the left towards Pearl Harbor, and Murata continued on a southerly direction with the Akagi and Kaga groups. They were going to hit the part called Battleship Row. Murata's formation found a slightly longer route just outside of the Waianae Mountains around the corner of the Ava airfield, over the entrance to Pearl Harbor, and finally over part of Hickam to attack from the south or from the eastern side of Pearl Harbor. Within a few minutes after departing from the Murata's formation, Matsumura could see Pearl Harbor about 20 kilometers off in the distance. Pearl Harbor was highly visible in the early morning sun. The Soryu torpedo squadron leader, his name was Nagai, was leading his group behind and to the left, and he sped up, got alongside of Matsumura's aircraft, and through hand signals urged him to quicken the pace. Nagai was apparently eager to fulfill his assignment to attack the western side of Pearl Harbor. At 7:50 a.m., the go-ahead was given for Nagai to release, and he wiggled his wings, and down they went towards Pearl Harbor. The gentleman in the previous photograph, this photograph and the following photograph, is named Yoshioka, and he apparently was the bombardier on board the aircraft that hit the USS Utah, and we'll talk more about that later, and eventually we will do an actual piece on just him himself, but I wanted to include that picture of him. Here's the USS Utah as it was in its final yard time in Bremerton, being painted into the darker Measure 1 scheme, and here it is with all of those boards on the deck to act in the target role that it was about to play. If it had not been sunk at Pearl Harbor, it was due to head back to the States the next day. So now let's talk a little bit about Nagai's torpedo attack. They came in from the northwestern lock area, and up ahead, of course, the visibility wasn't great, but they saw what appeared to be a very large capital ship. They'd been briefed not to hit the Utah, but in the heat of battle and confusion, well, this is what happened. So Nagai and his wingman, whose name was Mori, they recognized that there were no worthwhile targets, and you can see here the Utah on the left-hand side starting to roll over. They could recognize no worthwhile targets, so they went around, and they actually wound up hitting the ships on the other side where you see the torpedo splashes. They wound up hitting the ships on Battleship Row. However, the third and fourth pilots, named Hirata and named Tadashi and Kimura, those gentlemen were the ones that apparently were the ones that dropped on the USS Utah, as well as a Kimura, Nakajima were also involved in dropping torpedoes towards the Utah. One missed so badly it went between the Utah and the St. Louis, and the other one actually hit, or the Raleigh, and it hit the Raleigh. So, but two of the torpedoes did hit the USS Utah, and you can see here the Utah has rolled over in these high-level photographs from the Japanese. Those the 8 planes from the Soryu unit continued on, went back to base, all returned safely, but the damage to the Utah was done. Even though it did have torpedo blisters, and you can see them very well there on the side of it rolled over. It's still the very powerful Thunderfish opened up a couple of large holes, and immediately the ship rolled over and sank into the mud at Pearl Harbor. But the names that I have for the pilots were Nagai and Mori, the leader for the Soryu group, and Mori, the wingman. Harada, Kimura, Nakajima, Fujiwara, Sato, and a Mr. Kawashima. Wow, the 8 pilots in the group. And again, the one gentleman that we looked at earlier apparently was the bombardier on board one of the planes that hit the Utah, and he was actually the last of the Japanese aviators to pass away just recently. So we will be doing a show just on him himself. But these pictures from the archives showing the USS Utah trying to roll it back over, trying to salvage it. There were a lot of issues, a lot of cost involved, and eventually it was just given up. They decided that it wasn't financially worth it, and that it was out of the way enough that they could still moor other ships nearby. So a memorial plaque was placed in 1950 here on the upper deck, and to the right side is where some of the anti-aircraft mounts were at one time. Here's another great picture where you can see, and the bow is on the left end, but you can see where it sat there at Pearl Harbor. Now today, if you look, here is, this was taken in 52, but you can see the Arizona wreck, and you can see over there where the Utah is. This gives you some idea of where it's all oriented on Ford Island. When I was there in the early 2000s, I got to go over and visit the USS Utah Memorial and look. It looks like you could just reach out and touch it sitting there in the water. But what's important are those 2 white buildings, those 2 towers on the right-hand side. That's the angle that the aircraft took that came in that hit the USS Utah. Chief Water Tender Peter Tomich, who gave his life trying to save other members of the crew, was awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor for his service and his dedication to duty. And this was given to the state of Utah because at the time there was no living ancestors found for him. So here's some pictures that I took of my USS Utah model that I built in 1/425 scale, and I tried to orient it so that the light would be more, how can I put it, more realistic to what you would have seen at the time. But here it is with all of those planks on board, again in the auxiliary training role for bombing, dropping bombs on it, practice bombs. It was also a gunnery training ship, so it had all these anti-aircraft guns all over, but they were covered with dog houses so that they didn't get damaged by the practice bombs. But this great picture here of what it would have appeared like on that morning as the aviators dropped their Thunderfish and moved on. So I hope you guys got something out of this today, and we'll do more in the future on the USS Utah, on the aviators, and more on some of the other torpedo attacks. We've got to finish talking about what Matsumura did with his group, and we will do that some other time. So thanks for joining us today.